We all think we know the story of the Donner Party, a cautionary tale of pioneers, snow, and the ultimate taboo. But what if the real story isn't just about what happened in those frozen mountains, but about every single inexplicable decision that made it inevitable? This is a story shrouded in mystery, not just by snow, but by staggering incompetence, arrogant ambition, and a series of choices so bizarre they defy all logic. Why did a group of wealthy, seemingly prepared settlers ignore every single warning placed directly in their path? Why did they trust a man who had never even taken his own shortcut? And how did a simple journey west transform into a nightmare of betrayal, starvation, and a fate worse than death? From a late start that defied all wisdom, to a fatal river crossing, to a promised guide who vanished without a trace. The truth is far stranger and more unsettling than the legend. This is the story of how 87 people walked into a trap of their own making, and how a dozen bizarre contradictions sealed their horrifying fate. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. The optimal period for embarking on the journey westward was considered to be April, particularly the middle of the month, as climatic circumstances were then most suitable for those undertaking lengthy voyages by wagon. A departure around this period allowed one to evade the muddy conditions of spring, which were notoriously unkind to wheels, while also missing the mountain winters and getting through the passes before the cold weather's onset. This timing also ensured the prairie grasses had grown sufficiently to nourish the livestock, should they grow hungry. Once snow covered the ground, traversing the frozen terrain became a perilous and sluggish endeavor at best, and at the very worst, meant desperately consuming one's fellow human travelers. The Donner Party set out on May 12th, nearly a full month later than was advisable, for reasons that remain unclear. The Donner Party, under the guidance of the affluent brothers George and Jacob Donner and their associate, Irish immigrant James Reed, encountered serious difficulties very early in their expedition. The group became stranded on the unfavorable side of the Big Blue River, which flows through areas of Nebraska and Kansas. On May 26, 1846, the party arrived at the river to find that recent intense rainfall had caused the water level to swell by 20 feet, creating a significantly more challenging obstacle to cross. They spent several days waiting idly on the riverbanks, constructing rafts to transport their wagons and possessions to the other side. This procedure will likely be recognizable to anyone acquainted with the well-known computer game, The Oregon Trail. Sadly for Sarah Keyes, the decision to delay and build these rafts had deadly consequences. She passed away from tuberculosis on May the 29th. After 2 more days, the level of the Big Blue River had fallen sufficiently for the party to cross without any additional losses or unexpected outbreaks of dysentery. Prior to embarking on any lengthy expedition, a thorough evaluation of one's provisions is essential. This, however, did not appear to be a chief concern for the Donner family, or at the very least was deemed less critical than the storage capacity for their other belongings. They departed from Independence, Missouri, carrying supplies intended to last them merely 4 months. This quantity would have been just sufficient for a typical voyage to California, albeit becoming somewhat meager in the final stages, provided no mishaps occurred. Given the confined space within the covered wagons and a strict weight limit to consider, the Donners traveled light, allotting only 150 pounds of flour and 75 pounds of meat per individual. Their supplies also consisted of rice, beans, and cornmeal to introduce greater diversity and nutritional balance into their everyday diet, a consideration that would eventually become far less significant to the famished migrants. By the end of June, the Donner Group had at last arrived at Fort Laramie in Wyoming, running more than a week behind their intended timetable. During their stay at the fort, they received multiple warnings regarding the new Hastings cutoff path. This proposed shortcut promised to trim roughly 300 miles from other established trails, yet it was not the effortless passage it was claimed to be. A man named James Kleiman, who had just returned from traveling the Hastings cutoff alongside Lansford Hastings, informed James Reed that the trail was nearly impractical to navigate on foot. Furthermore, Kleiman stated that attempting it with covered wagons would be out of the question. Kleiman advised the Donners to remain on the customary trail and avoid taking risks with the Hastings cutoff. Regrettably, for a number of individuals in the later consumed expedition, this counsel was dismissed, and the group gambled on the road less taken, the Hastings cutoff. Speaking of Lansford Hastings, this gentleman was, frankly, a thoroughly unimpressive character. Hastings professed to have uncovered a novel pathway to California. He even had the audacity to publish a guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which featured his supposedly superior shortcut, modestly titled The Hastings Cutoff, purportedly enabling a quicker journey as it was the most straightforward route. Hastings, effectively serving as the promotional board for California in that era, was among those accountable for popularizing the western migration to California for pioneers. There was, however, one rather significant issue. Hastings had not, in fact, personally traversed the trail bearing his name until after his guidebook had already gained notoriety. He was one of just 2 individuals recorded to have attempted the route, neither of whom had evaluated its feasibility for covered wagons. To market this inadequately researched guide, Hastings proposed to personally escort a party of emigrants along the Hastings cutoff. He sent a letter to the Donner Party, enticing them to journey with the renowned Hastings himself of guidebook and shortcut fame. Unable to decline this magnanimous proposal, the Donner Party arranged to rendezvous with Hastings at Fort Bridger. Due to their 2-week delay, their paths never actually intersected. Hastings's letter, however, was composed with such supreme confidence and persuasiveness that they proceeded without him, guideless, along an unverified trail to the west coast. What could possibly go awry? Edward Bryant was a reporter who had personal familiarity with the Hastings cutoff. He knew from experience the trail was rugged, unproven, and likely perilous. Bryant was especially worried about the women and children accompanying the expedition. He understood the route was far too hazardous, to the point of being impracticable, for them to traverse without risk. He communicated his apprehensions in letters to the Donner Party, earnestly begging them to choose the established trail and avoid the ill-fated shortcut. Those letters, as fate would have it, were never delivered. Both Bryant and Reed later charged Jim Bridger with deliberately seizing the correspondence. Jim Bridger, the owner of the Bridger Trading Post, stood to profit significantly if emigrants chose the Hastings cutoff and made a brief layover at his establishment to purchase provisions. Consequently, Bridger was a major proponent of people using Hastings' route, which is the probable reason he suppressed the letters cautioning against the cutoff. Let's hope that 30 cents he got for the guide was worth it, Jim. Upon reaching the Wasatch Mountains, located just beyond the Great Salt Lake portion of Hastings's ill-conceived cutoff, the Donner Party came across a message Hastings had fastened to a wooden post. After all, if propriety instructs us in one thing, it's that leaving a note attached to a stick in the wild is always a sound practice. Hastings had written that the way forward was treacherous, and he did not believe it prudent to proceed along that track, adding that he would meet the group and lead them toward a superior, less implausible trail. The Donners and their fellow migrants resolved to wait and hear what Hastings proposed. They remained, despite unease about halting progress, having already fallen badly behind schedule. When 8 days passed and Hastings appeared to have vanished on the group, James Reed and 2 others ventured out to locate their absent guide and maintain the expedition's momentum. Reed did eventually find Hastings, though his companions became disoriented and grew so famished they nearly consumed their own horses. A relative delicacy, foreshadowing the horrors to come. Hastings guided Reed toward an alternate, unidentified path through the Wasatch Mountains, which he guaranteed would be superior. Even though Hastings had provided ample cause for distrust, Reed brought these new directions back to the party, and it turned out, unsurprisingly, to also be poor. This supposedly enhanced route was so clogged with obstructions challenging for a wagon train to negotiate, minor inconveniences like trees requiring physical removal, that it added critical days to a journey already desperately short on time. At their slowest, the group advanced only 1.5 miles per day compared to the typical pioneer average of 15. Despite giving the impression of a disorganized and haphazard collection of assorted wanderers, many individuals were actually eager to join this ill-fated expedition. At multiple stages along the route, they incorporated additional stray families to augment their contingent. In July, they took on further immigrants while stopped at Fort Bridger. Then, during August, as they were laboriously clearing a path through the Wasatch Mountains, the aptly named Graves Party also elected to participate in all the excitement. Once the Graves Party had joined, the collective number increased to 87 individuals, placing a significant strain upon the already diminished stock of supplies. The Donner Group was similarly unequipped for the harsh traveling environment of the desert surrounding the Great Salt Lake. Wagons continually became mired in the sandy terrain. It was an especially inopportune moment to be immobilized, with the arid conditions bringing the wagon trains to a standstill and dehydrated members consuming the water reserves at an alarming rate. Those water supplies diminished much more rapidly than they had ever anticipated. Several of the oxen became so feeble they were abandoned in the desert to perish, while others simply bolted, offering a firm refusal as they fled toward a more promising existence for an ox. And so continued a death march across the desert. Had they selected one of the more frequented routes to California, the oxen would most probably have been saved. The Donner Party paused to rest at Humboldt Sink, a parched lake basin in Nevada, for several relaxed days. The livestock required respite and nourishment to stay healthy and survive the remainder of the trip to California. One evening during this stopover, however, the situation worsened when a local Native American tribe made off with 21 of their cattle. This incident became something of a recurring pattern for the group throughout the remainder of their travels. Native Americans persistently shot or pilfered their herds until nearly 100 head of cattle were lost. Deprived of their oxen, the party also lost the means to pull their covered wagons, forcing them to abandon some of the vehicles. The task of transporting their belongings then shifted onto the actual shoulders of the people, who had to trek onward carrying heavy burdens. It also dashed their contingency plan of consuming the cows. From the very outset, things were not harmonious within the full company. Competing factions created divisions, and in July of 1846, the wagon train separated for the first time. The larger contingent elected to follow the conventional, safer path, while the smaller group chose, fatefully, to attempt the Hastings cutoff. When their situation began to deteriorate in the Wasatch Mountains, the group's mood turned hostile. They held James Reed responsible for originally championing this foolish, problematic route. As the journey became increasingly dangerous, the travelers grew genuinely irritable from hunger and fatigue. On October 5th, 2 wagons became entangled, and John Snyder, who was driving one of them, began savagely beating his oxen, an act that greatly displeased James Reed, who objected to this cruelty toward the animals. Reed commanded the man to cease, and when Snyder persisted, Reed directly stabbed him in the abdomen. John Snyder perished from his injury. With no legal system along the wagon trail or any prison in which to incarcerate Reed for murder, the group was forced to administer justice themselves. Some felt that hanging him was the appropriate sentence, but others argued for simply banishing him. That is certainly a severe penalty. The second faction prevailed, and Reed was duly ostracized, sent away for having killed another man over an ox. Having scarcely recovered from this event, 2 days later, the party lost another member when a 70-year-old man became too feeble to go on. In their mounting desperation, the group resolved to abandon him to his fate. Grandpa would have wanted it that way, my boy. Finally, by October of 1846, the Donner Party had technically arrived in California. Alder Creek, to be more precise, a location within the Sierra Nevada mountain range just beyond the state boundary, but still within California. So they had succeeded, correct? Everything concludes well, yes? Yes. Well, no. The group had been assured that snowfall would not arrive until November. However, as this expedition appeared to be cursed, it was already snowing in October, and the party found themselves once more ill-equipped. As they attempted to force a passage across the mountains, they were struck by an early blizzard, which left them isolated and trapped for several months. The choice to consume human flesh was not the initial action taken by the stranded pioneers. After their food was exhausted, they first resorted to eating boiled bones and animal hides, followed by a secondary menu of leather, tree bark, or oxhide. It should be noted that the hides were at that time serving as roofing material for their improvised shelters. And ultimately, in a final act of desperation to survive the winter, they consumed their deceased companions. Not every individual partook of these grim provisions, however. Some elected to starve to death instead. Out of the 87 people who entered the Wasatch Mountains, only 48 individuals and 3 mules ultimately reached California, alive. And so, 48 survivors emerged from the snow, forever carrying the weight of the mountains they crossed and the choices that brought them there. We are left with one chilling question that history still can't answer. Was it a perfect storm of misfortune? Or a blueprint for disaster, drawn by human hands from the very beginning? What do you think was the single point of no return? Share your theory in the comments.